Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Ashley Fent, and on behalf of Community Alliance for Global Justice, AgroWatch, and AFSA, the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, who is co-sponsoring today's event, I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and especially a big thanks to our panelists for participating in what we hope will be a really lively and informative discussion. We are recording today's webinar and we'll save the link afterwards to be shared with all of you. And we hope that you'll also share it widely with your networks. We do request that all audience members please keep your mic and your video turned off throughout the webinar in order to ensure that we have a good video quality and bandwidth capacity for the speakers and for the video recording. Speakers are, of course, welcome to have their videos on throughout the webinar. I'm joining the webinar today as an uninvited white settler on the land of the Puyallup tribe, land which Washington State Governor Isaac Stevens seized through the illegitimate Treaty of Medicine Creek in 1854. And I'd like to invite all of us to take a moment to acknowledge the historical and present stewards of the lands that we're on, and those Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have contributed often unacknowledged, uncompensated, and unrecognized labor to sustaining life in those places. Bill Gates' wealth accrued through monopoly capitalism in the tech industry, his dominance over global agricultural policies, his status as the largest single private owner of farmland in the US, topics that we'll be covering today. These are all logical extensions of the racist colonial values and practices that are central to how the US in particular functions. And in this virtual space that we're connecting through today, a space that's facilitated by our PCs, Macs, and smartphones, a space where land may ostensibly seem less relevant. In this space, we're still relying on a system of extraction and violence that is most severely enacted on BIPOC lands, lives, and bodies around the world. From the minerals mined in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo to the fossil fuels needed to maintain and power massive data centers. So we come together today from different positions and privileges in relation to this system and with different relationships to the lands that we're on. So I encourage us all to remain mindful of these positions and the differential debts and responsibilities that accompany them throughout today's discussion. And I encourage us also to consider how dismantling Gates's influence also requires a dismantling of the broader ideologies and systems that have made it possible. And now I'll pass it over to Noel to share a little bit of the history and successes of AgroWatch.
Thank you, Ashley. Hi, everyone. My name is Noel Hutton. I'm an organizer with Community Alliance for Global Justice, who is hosting this webinar today. And we are a Seattle-based membership organization founded 20 years ago by activists who helped organize the historic World Trade Organization protests in 1999. Today, our mission is to strengthen the global food sovereignty movement. And AgroWatch is a campaign from CAGJ to challenge the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's role in African agriculture through AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. We started this work 13 years ago in 2008, drawing on our strategic location in Seattle, which is home to the Gates Foundation, and on our relationships with Kenyan farmers. I'll briefly mention a few key successes and highlights over the years. In 2010, we gained media attention when we learned that the Gates Foundation had invested in Monsanto stock. In 2014, we hosted the Africa-US Food Sovereignty Strategy Summit in Seattle with 8 African and 20 US leaders to build relationships and joint work. In 2018, 3 AgroWatch members participated in AFSA's Food Systems Conference and General Member Assembly in Senegal, where we became a Friends of AFSA member. And last year, we published 2 important reports, including our analysis of how the Gates Foundation funds pro-biotechnology propaganda through the Cornell Alliance for Science. We are also excited to have recently hired a new full-time consultant, which is Ashley, and to be participating in broader multi-organizational collective research and organizing efforts. And now I'll pass it off to AgroWatch member Matt Canfield, who will outline a bit more of the political context among which our organizing is situated before we meet today's panelists.
Thanks, Noel. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our participants and audience members. My name is Matt Canfield. I've been working with AgroWatch since 2013. And today we're going to be discussing the powerful influence of the Gates Foundation on shaping agricultural development and global food systems. Now, over the past 18 months, we've seen the influence of the Gates Foundation and his foundation explode. As the co-chair of the world's largest private philanthropy, Gates has long exercised outside sway over global politics, particularly in his foundation's two longtime areas of work, agricultural development and public health. But the COVID-19 pandemic has really offered an unprecedented opportunity for Gates to set the agenda and promote his market-driven and technology-centered vision of global development, paving the way for the corporate capture of our food, climate, and our health. Now, Gates's emergence as an unaccountable global leader raises really profound concerns. As a former technology monopolist, Gates has a long history of privatizing public goods for corporate profit. And he approaches philanthropy much like a Silicon Valley venture capitalist, even referring to his work as venture and catalytic philanthropy. And in this approach, governments are primarily valued as facilitators for global markets, not as arenas of democratic decision-making. He's lobbied extensively at national and global levels for policies that subsidize private entrepreneurship and technological development, liberalize markets, and protect intellectual property rights. In other words, Gates seeks to socialize the risks of entrepreneurship while privatizing the rewards. And it's for this reason that Gates's approach to philanthropy is called philanthrocapitalism, because it extends the principles of capitalist and market development into sectors once valued as public goods. But a consequence of this approach is that, like many Silicon Valley startups, most of his initiatives have failed with drastic consequences for those who they claim to help. And one of the most stunning recent failures has been Gates's leadership of the vaccine response to the global pandemic. As the novel coronavirus spread, the Gates Foundation and its grantees took the lead on the World Health Organization's COVID vaccine response. And the COVAX response, developed by the Gates Foundation, sidelined alternative initiatives that were meant to share technology and instead empowered Gates grantees and pharmaceutical industry associations. And as a result, Gates's emphasis of protecting intellectual property rights, today, most vaccines have gone to people in high-income countries, while low and middle-income countries who are now facing the deadliest stages of the pandemic have little access to vaccines. The Gates Foundation approach to agricultural development, which is a less publicized arena, has also failed. So since 2006, the foundation has spent $6 billion on a mammoth effort to impose green revolution technologies onto African agriculture through its subsidiary, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, as well as its own funding streams. And green revolution technologies include hybrid and genetically modified seeds, synthetic fertilizers, and agrochemicals, all of which are privately owned inputs. And in addition to this, the foundation has aggressively lobbied African governments to open up agricultural markets to corporate investment and institute strong intellectual property rights for plant breeders and seed companies. Now, for years, the foundation failed to provide evaluations of its programs. But in the last year, numerous reports, as well as a recently released report from the Gates Foundation, found that the foundation's initiative have failed to meet even their own stated efforts to double the productivity of African farmers. But what's worse is that research has also indicated that farmers who have adopted these technologies are going into debt without adequate markets or credits to even cover their costs. And worse yet, the Gates Foundation's green revolution has failed to feed local population. Food insecurity has actually increased in many of the target countries in which the Gates Foundation and AGRA operates. The only measure by which the Gates-led green revolution has been a success is the profits that the private sector is now extracting from African agriculture. But in spite of all of these failures, Gates and his allies are now taking this strategy global through the UN Food System Summit. In 2019, the UN Secretary General called for a global food system summit as part of efforts to meet the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And the Secretary General named the president of AGRA, Dr. Agnes Kalibata, to lead the summit, despite opposition from civil society organizations in 83 countries. Kalibata has deployed a multi-stakeholder strategy in organizing this summit. That is a structure that aligns the corporate sector as partners on equal footing with states and civil society. And through this structure, which might seem to be more democratic, given that it claims to be inclusive and participatory, the Food System Summit has been anything but. 3 current and past UN special rapporteurs on the right to food wrote publicly that the summit has all but abandoned the human rights framework that centers the duties of governments to address the needs of rights holders, people who face worsening food insecurity. As the special rapporteurs wrote, the rules of engagement were determined by a small set of actors, the private sector, organizations serving the private sectors, scientists, and economists who initiated this process. And as a result, food sovereignty movements around the world have come together to oppose the summit and the corporate solutions to global hunger that it is proposing. At a time when many people are stuck at home fearing for their lives and livelihoods, Gates is leveraging the converging global crises of COVID, climate change, and global hunger to further expand his influence. His innovation agenda represents the convergence of 2 trends. First, the expansion of new digital technologies that are concentrating data and knowledge in the hands of multinational corporations. And second, the decline of democracy at national and global levels. In effect, Gates is paving the way for what some have called neo-illiberalism, pushing corporate solutions ever deeper into our lives without accountable and democratic institutions. And while he presents this carefully crafted persona of what New York Times columnist Timothy Egan calls a lavender sweater Mr. Rogers, Gates has managed to increasingly expand his monopoly from our operating systems of our computers to those of our democratic institutions. And today our speakers are going to reflect on his influence and the problems that it poses for our health, food, and planet, as well as what we can do to resist this growing corporate takeover. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Ashley.
Thank you, Matt, for that great introduction and political context. I'd like to ask the panelists to introduce themselves and a bit about their organizations. And we'll go in speaking order. So if we could begin with Shakira.
Thanks, Ashley. Peace, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. I'm Shakira Tyler, and I'm with the Black Dirt Farm Collective, and we're an organization or a collective of Black agrarians, to be very general, who we consider ourselves to be guiding a political education process focused exclusively on Black communities throughout the African diaspora, on reconnecting with the land. And we have what we call agroecology as our social methodology, where we activate Black agrarian communities' personal, cultural, and technical capacities to be used as transformative organizing tools. And we deeply consider this work to be connected to our identities and a recovery of our agrarian diasporic histories. And I'll allow the next panelist to go.
Thank you, Ashley and Shakira. My name is Maina. I'm the National Coordinator for the Biodiversity and Biosafety Association of Kenya. We are a network working in Kenya focusing on issues of biodiversity, promoting agroecology and food sovereignty. And we are also members of the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. And I'm here representing BIBA-Kenya and AFSA as a member of AFSA. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shakira and Ashley. My name is Jim Thomas. I work with an organization called Etc. Group. We're an international collective of researchers and activists who try to track emerging technologies, corporate strategies, particularly around the food system, biodiversity, and human rights, and try and understand the implications of new trends and so forth on the most marginalized people, on biodiversity. I'm based in so-called Quebec and so-called Canada on traditional Mohawk territory. I'll pass over to Stephano.
Thank you so much, and Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stephano Prado from the Society for International Development, but I guess here, more than in my simple SID capacity, I'm also here because of the active role that I play within the civil society and indigenous peoples mechanism to the Committee on World Food Security that has been the originator and the proponent of the people's counter mobilization to transform the corporate food system, which has been opposing the Food System Summit for many of the reasons that Matt has explained before, and more that I will elaborate upon during our discussion. Great to be here with all of you.
Thank you to our panelists for joining us once again. And I'd like to now move on to the roundtable discussion portion of the webinar. So the way that we'll do this, we'll pose questions. We have asked a panel, like one panelist to respond initially, and then we'll open it up to other panelists for comment and discussion. So the first question we'd like to direct specifically at Shakira to respond first. We've seen in the news lately that Bill Gates is the single largest private owner of farmland in the United States through his investment company, Cascade Investment. And at the same time, as Matt laid out in his intro, the Gates Foundation is the largest charitable foundation in the world, and it drives policy directions and agendas in public health, agriculture, and education. What's the significance of this growing billionaire control over power, land, and resources, both in the US and globally, and how does it connect to racial inequality?
Yeah, that's a big question, and I'll do my best to touch upon all important angles. So I'll start with the reality of industrial agriculture that originated here in what is now the US, or what we more appropriately know as Turtle Island, of the indigenous peoples, and how that's been a main facilitative tool of colonization, which drove racial capitalism and so on, all of the intersecting oppressions that we fight against on a regular basis. And so this is a very well thought out, empirical driven system that is driven on exploitation and extraction of land and people, right? And then this very obscene system has been exported to other places from, or exported to other places around the world. And we see this in the privatization of seeds, or mostly everything that farmers need to live from, right? And then the diminishing reality of public goods and the commons. And so we know that land is power, land is wealth, and more importantly, land is about race and class. And the relationship to land and who owns it and who works it and who cares for it reflects the really atrocious levels of inequality and legacies of colonialism and white supremacy that we see here on Turtle Island and around the globe generally. And it's not a coincidence that white farmers own 98% of the land here, not just Gates, Bill Gates as this wealthy investor owning 242,000 acres of farmland. White wealthy people in general own 98% of the farmland, which was facilitated historically by the 1862 Homestead Act that opened up 270 million acres of indigenous territories. And that's, they say about 10% of US land for white settlement. And then approximately 230 more million acres went to white privately owned businesses. And of course, Black indigenous people of color were categorically and strategically excluded from the benefits of this federal legislation that subsidized and protected generations of white wealth. And so we're seeing we are living in the aftermath of that vast land theft that happened decades or centuries ago today. And we know that Gates and other billionaire investors claim to be climate conscious people that are justifying their land grabs in the name of green capitalism, right? And we know that particularly Black indigenous people of color continue to be exploited in the name of climate mitigation. And so it's really interesting that this common argument for arable farmland to meet carbon neutral targets for sustainable investment portfolios is being used to justify these land grabs, where we know that peasant farmers, whether they identify as peasant farmers or not, are the main propellant of feeding the world on a global level, right? And that's just not in the quote unquote developing world, as some people like to say, but it's also here in the US where many small farmers are driving the food system. We saw that with the collapse of the industrial food system with COVID, and who fed our communities? It was the small farmers and the urban gardeners in our communities that fed one another. And so it's just really a really interesting thing that we have to understand that this is a system that originated in the 15th century with the theft of indigenous lands and the enslavement of Black bodies. And now we see this really obscene system having really atrocious results all around the world, where land consolidation, privatization, health disparities, and so on are producing the results that we have before us today. And so there's a lot more that I could say about that, but I also really want to hear what other panelists have to say. So I'm going to stop there.
Jim, it sounds like you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean, mostly I want to say amen. That's exactly correct. It's really very clearly explained by Shakira. And I think, there's another aspect of Gates' plans that we'll probably come on to talk about, which is, his technological plans and some of his business plans, that acquiring 250,000 acres of hectares of land fits perfectly into. That under the part of the sort of opportunism that he's engaged in, other billionaires are engaged with, is this opportunism of trying to create new markets in soil carbon, which will be enabled by high-tech approaches such as digital agriculture, which Matt referred to. And this notion that if you can have large amounts of land that will be farmed digitally, and not by people, but increasingly just by robots and data. And then you could somehow show, using algorithms, particularly all data controlled by Microsoft, that there is somehow sequestration of carbon going on. That's a huge new industry that's being driven as a result of the promises by Fortune 500 companies to reach so-called net zero. And I think Gates is setting himself up. He always is doing this. He's making long bets, and he's making long bets on soil and soil carbon as a major commodity, as well as using those lands for a test bed for new technologies.
Does anyone else want to jump in? I mean, and do you see any connections between the sort of concentration of land ownership by Gates in the US and some of the issues that we're seeing in terms of land grabs and concentration of land on the African continent, and how agro and Gates are involved?
Yeah, I can see the linkage quite well. If I look at a country like South Africa, yeah, huge challenges. Having gotten like independence in 1994, and land still being controlled and sources of production being controlled by most of the white settler or the white population in there. And recently you could see in the media, there was a lot of upheaval, a lot of it caused by COVID, brought a lot of job losses, lack of income, access to food. And so the population was reacting, and you could see like the malls were being attacked. Because your everyday, like South Africa is really an example of the very rich and the very poor who live alongside each other. In my previous interaction, even within South Africa while traveling, just move like 100 kilometers out of the city, and you find townships where most of the poor are concentrated. They don't even have access to flush toilets, electricity. And even that lack of knowledge, because even the apartheid area ensured that the Black people did not even have, did not get the knowledge to dig, because I once visited a group where the farmers each had about 10 acres, but they didn't know how to farm. They are so dependent on grants and all that. And so even when you do not teach from the beginning, from the younger generation, that becomes a challenge. If you look at the case of Kenya, where I come from, for example, we still find a lot of corporate concentration in terms of land ownership. And increasingly, we are having what we are calling conservancies, mostly in the arid regions where a lot of the big and the rich people are going there, even some not Kenyan, and buying and consolidating land in the name of conservation. And from a report that I was reading, they now own so much land. The name is that this is land where the wild animals, we are keeping them, we have to protect them. But you can see that kind of corporate concentration of land, which is going to be the key, will lead to the next world wars, because people don't have access to land. Water will become a big issue, you know, having corporations controlling water and other sources of production. Thank you.
Yeah, Stephano, do you want to jump in?
Yes, thanks. Just a very small addition. It's also important to recognize that the massive wealth that some of these billionaires and philanthropic capitalists have amounted is also the result of failures of tax systems, and in many ways the capture of normative and fiscal regimes to their benefits, both through several layers of fiscal incentives or to tax regimes that have facilitated loopholes according to which system became increasingly regressive, and in many cases facilitated illicit financial flows from particularly the global south to tax havens and other particular locations where clearly they basically do not pay taxes. And this is always important to point out, and it's quite significant because we are also very often confronted with this role of philanthropies as a way to construe, let's say, a lot of supporting narratives that somehow try to portray the moral justification for privilege, you know, and it's quite interesting, particularly, for instance, in the African context, as the old narrative of the Africa raising or the African Renaissance has been accompanied by the number of billionaires as a key indicators of progress, you know, and part of this is precisely this idea of rendering morally acceptable this notion of privilege. And very often the role of philanthropies actually continue to consolidate this imaginary that actually privilege does some good to society. And while in fact, I'm sure we'll on this call, we'll all agree this is not the case. So I think that was only my small little addition to what other colleagues have already contributed to.
Great, thank you all. I think we'll go ahead and move on to the second question, which is about the emphasis on productivist and business-oriented models of agriculture. And we'll direct this question first to Maina, who's been part of longstanding efforts to hold agro accountable in Africa. And to set up this next question, we want to show a short clip from a film, or a kind of promotional film that the Gates Foundation produced in 2014 that's entitled The Agri Story, The March Toward a Green Revolution in Africa.
People say Africa is a continent of tomorrow. To me, this seems a lot like yesterday. But it doesn't have to be this way. Farming can be more than an existence. It can be a business. We don't have to just survive. We can thrive. Let me show you what I mean. This is Faustina. Faustina learned how to plant the right kind of peas. These new pigeon peas are drought resistant. They prevent erosion and they fetch a higher price than ordinary beans. Trees fix nitrogen into the soil so that other crops can thrive. They make a very good team. And Tura here follows a technique called microdosing, applying small and affordable doses of fertilizer to the spots where it's most needed. His yields have been fantastic.
So this video goes on to elaborate some of these things about, technologies and techniques that are associated with the green revolution that can increase productivity and, as the actress in the film said, run African farming like a business. And this sentiment is widely echoed by discussions among economists and development agencies about how African agriculture is not realizing its full potential and could be made more efficient and quote unquote productive with the help of businesses and corporations. And I think people in the United States in particular often see this as a good thing because it would look a lot like how the US food system operates. And for many people, that looks like going to the supermarket, having an abundance of quote unquote choices over what they buy. So Anne, we'll start off with you. How would you respond to this obsession with business and productivity in agriculture?
Thank you, Ashley. I think one of the issues that has been raised there is often when we work on issues of agroecology, we are told that we are keeping the farmers still in the backward way. But it's important to clarify that we do not say that business is bad in agriculture, but it has to be holistic. For us, we are promoting agroecology. And with agroecology, we're ensuring the sustainable production of food for the current generation and the future generation. And when we say we promote this agroecology doesn't, when we do it, we produce with minimum production of greenhouse gases. We produce it by taking care of the environment, conserving our biodiversity, safe and producing for better nutrition and food sovereignty, and of course, putting money in the farmers' pockets. When you talk about a productivity revolution that is being pushed by Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, unfortunately, not much is said about the failure in Asia. And we say that we are promoting a revolution, or AGRA says they're promoting a productivity revolution in Africa, but this we have seen has been a total failure. Last year, we produced a report called the False Promises Report together with several organizations. And we realized from the work of the Alliance for a Green Revolution, when they started off, they spoke of 100% increase in doubling of yields by 2020. Unfortunately, the staple yields has grown only by just 12% since 12 years into the Green Revolution program by AGRA, after spending almost $1 billion, over $1 billion. And what is sad about it is that African governments have been convinced, working on policy, to put policies where they give what they call subsidies, but they're not sustainable. And you find cases where even the subsidies are not, they're given for 2 years and then they stop. These subsidies includes like hybrid seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides. Unfortunately, because of that non-consistency and lack of money, that has been a challenge, but also for us, agroecology, we do not promote the use of synthetic pesticides and fertilizers. But also when you look at the promise that was made that poverty would end in Africa, unfortunately, it continues to be endemic and farmers keep on falling short. So what happens? The farmer goes and gets subsidies or is using all these green revolution inputs and technologies that are being promoted, but production is low. The case of Tanzania showed that the farmer in a home of 2 adults, they could not meet their GDP requirements. So the farmers would harvest and maybe keep some for their food, but have to sell some because of poverty. They need to take their children to school, they need to access medical care, sell it. And when the dry period comes, they're forced to go back to the market and buy it at an expensive, buy the maize at an expensive price, which is the staple food, the maize. And so you see poverty has continued to go high. Then the subsidies also favored crops such as maize. It's a staple in sub-Saharan Africa, in most of sub-Saharan Africa, but there are other climate resilient crops like millet and sorghums, which were produced for many years. But because the AGRA program promoted maize as the crop that is important in some cases where when a loan was given in the form of seed, the hybrid seed. The farmer had no choice to choose what kind of seed to plant. They were given a plan on the fertilizer to use, the inputs, the other pesticides to apply. So they don't have that right to choice. This led to a decrease in production of the other staples that are very important for food security and nutrition. As a result, chronic hunger increased, nutrition went down. And when you look at undernourishment, the number of undernourished people in agri countries increased to 30% from 2006 to 2018. This is a big challenge. I'm currently in the field in one of the counties in Kenya, called West Pokot, and we're having a discussions with farmers today where the Minister of Agriculture was challenging them and saying, in terms of food production, of the 47 counties in Kenya, you are number 2. But unfortunately, when we went to issues of nutrition and nourishment, you are number 47 out of 47. And the farmers spoke frankly and said, when we produce the food, they produce a lot of chicken, eggs, but sell milk. They sell the milk to get money because they need the money to take the children to school for their basic essentials. And so the children end up having a meal, for example, tea without milk. They don't eat the eggs. They're not accessing that nutrition. The county is number 2 in terms of production, but they're number last in terms of nutrition and nourishment because not much focus has been put. And one of the things that we're talking about when I was coming back, I was talking about how do we promote farmers to realize the importance of nutrition, because if you do not feed the children and catch them at that young age, then their health is compromised going forward. So what also happened after we did our false promises report in 2020, we approached AGRA requesting for evidence to either refuse our findings, but unfortunately AGRA refused to publish its own outcome monitoring reports. And so one organization in the US Right to Know organization, obtained some of the reports from the USA through the Freedom of Information Act, and these were published. From the analysis, you could see that 11 of the countries that had programs related to AGRA, none could report a positive impact on farmer yields, income, or food security. And this becomes a big challenge. We have gone forward, and this year in July, produced a June follow-up report on the false promises report, and it shows the challenges that AGRA has faced. Unfortunately, AGRA is considered very important important in terms of food production in Africa. And recently, the director, Dr. Agnes Kalibata, became the head of the UNFFS. We raised a lot of queries about that and the challenges related to that. But what do we want? When you talk about food production, those areas that have really succeeded did not go for huge revolutionary cases like a green revolution in Africa. Farmers just require access to water. If they could get water, sand dams, and do irrigation, it will make a big difference, because the biggest challenge is that we depend on rain-fed agriculture. We have a lot of food losses through post-harvest losses. Before the maize dries and gets to the market, there's a lot of loss in that value chain. What do we recommend? Value addition for future use, and it keeps it for longer. We also have the challenge of what you're talking about today was the issue of if you do not have food, how else can you access it? And there's these huge programs that have begun where there's even access to a grant, because access to getting food, food sovereignty or security is about access and affordability. Because if you can afford the food, you can get it from any part of the world. And you look at countries like, for example, the US. The US is a huge producer of food. There's a lot of food that goes to waste, but there are still people who sleep hungry in the US every day. So thank you very much. I would welcome my colleagues to give more points.
Speaking of the transition to the US, I was wondering if, Shakira, if you have any comments about kind of how your work has engaged with debates around productivity, business-oriented approaches, things like that.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. Thanks. And it was a really, really beautiful picture you painted. Really insightful, because we at the Black Dirt Farmers Collective farm in direct resistance and opposition to this system that you're describing, right? And so the reality that you're experiencing in Africa is very similar, although we have many more privileges living in the United States or here on Turtle Island, but it's a very similar context where we're choosing to farm in a way that produces more nutritional foods, and we have greater control over the seeds that we produce by keeping seeds, not just the actual seed, but the stories that come along with them, right? Because this is not just a technical act. Farming isn't just technical. For many of us, it's a cultural act, it's a political act. And so we know that saving our seeds and saving the stories that come along with them, and intercropping and using other agroecological techniques produces the reality that we need in a very straightforward way. Like it takes the theory to a different place where we can actually eat better, we can live better. Our water is clear, the biodiversity of our lands are thriving. And so we know that it's a noticeable difference using agroecological techniques, right? And the same system that's pushing this tech-driven agricultural enterprise in Africa and other places around the globe is the same system that started with the enslavement of Black bodies to produce cotton, rice, indigo, and other what became cash crops in the 15th and 16th centuries. And so we have to be very organized in how we resist this ingrained system of exploitation and extraction. So thank you for sharing your story.
Stephano or Jim, would you like to add any comments?
Maybe on my side, well, first, many thanks to Anne, who I think has captured very well many of the critical dimension. Maybe just adding a little bit of a sort of bird eye view on where agricultural productivism also play a role in a macro analysis. No, the grand narrative to feed the planet from which agricultural productivism is actually born. It's part and parcel of the global division of labor that emerged with the hegemonic and homogenizing agenda of hyper-globalization, which contributed to ossify inequalities between countries by clearly differentiating between the global north and the global south, what kind of role within the global division of labor different countries had. And this has led to increasing levels of commodity dependence in many respects, particularly in the African context, deindustrialization, almost exclusively export-led development strategies, which had on the other side of the coin unsustainable levels of foreign debt, which is another form of colonialism, and currency dependency. So, it's important to locate that particular narrative in this global organization of labor. The other critical dimension is that they have been really essential in the massive explosion of global value chains as the primary form of organization of the global economy, which has led to massive delocalizations, which help fragmenting the multiple dimensions of food system, particularly in terms of the social, ecological, and cultural implication of production, and generate distance between different levels of agency within food system, which are largely fragmented also agency and our capacity to really respond adequately to this sort of massive transition. So in addition, let's say, to the micro level, it's important also to understand how this has contributed and impacted to the macro organization of our economic systems in this sort of diseased hyper-globalization or globalization on steroids? Thanks.
I would just say two very short things additionally to that. I'm thinking about that video where the actress is saying about we need to make farming more like business. It's worth noting that agribusiness has failed, not just in terms of putting toxic chemicals and destroying the land and harming people. It's failed on its own terms. It doesn't really feed. So, you know, we know globally that 70% of the world feeds from the peasant food web. It doesn't feed from the agribusiness value chain. Agribusiness feeds 20 to 30% of people, not very well, and increasingly most of that goes to the waste, really, or is wasted. And when you even look at the numbers, you know, for every dollar that is spent on food in the food value chains of agribusiness, $2 is spent cleaning it up. So agribusiness doesn't do it very well to begin with. And you know, this is part of the way in which I think about the fact that Agra is still pushing for a green revolution, which was this kind of 60s productivist idea. You know, there were many ideas in the 1960s. This province I live in was a place where asbestos came from. In the 1960s, asbestos was thought to be a great idea. Nobody would think that anymore. This is one of the ideas from the 1960s that should have died a long time ago. I can't believe that it's being pushed in Africa and elsewhere.
So I think let's move on to the third question. And actually this previous question leads in well to it, because a lot of the contributions of industrial agriculture and productivist mindset to climate change are something that, you know, is hitting the news now, is something that all of us are very cognizant of. And at the same time, the Gates Foundation and the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa are pitching technological solutions as the fix to climate change, right? A problem that racial capitalism and settler colonialism has created in many ways. So recently, Bill Gates presented the annual McDougall Lecture at the 2021 Food and Agricultural Organization Conference. Citing the dual threats of COVID-19 and climate change, he argues that we have to focus on data and on technological innovation if we are to meet the second Sustainable Development Goal of ending hunger by 2030. He states, we need additional commitments from donors, governments, and the private sector to support innovation, better use of data, and other efforts to get new tools in the farmers' fields. By working together, using data to find effective interventions and encouraging innovation, I'm confident we can tackle climate change and help farmers adapt. So we'd like to ask Jim to first respond to this question. What are the impacts of the Gates Foundation's and Bill Gates' own emphasis on technology-driven approaches to agriculture in a changing climate?
Yeah, the impacts are very wide. You know, I think just to start with the question of why is Gates pushing technological solutions, data as an answer to climate change? Obviously, the simple answer is because he's a technologist, and if you know how to use a hammer, you treat every problem like a nail. But in a way, that's too simple, because he's actually not a very good technologist. He never has been. What Gates is a very good opportunist and a very good monopolist. And what's really going on here is very much what Matt was describing at the beginning of this, is philanthrocapitalism at its best, kind of disaster capitalism. That Gates is very good at using philanthropic language, philanthropic vehicles to place long economic bets or medium-term economic bets for his economic ventures. It's such a group. We recently, working with the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, IPES Food, we recently produced a report called The Long Food Movement, in which we were looking at what does the next 25 years of the food systems look like. And particularly our part of that work was trying to understand how agribusiness and philanthrocapitalists, how they see the next 25 years. And I think it's useful to bring to this discussion. individuals like Gates, the Gates Foundation, and agribusiness were very close. Some of the things that major for them in the next 25 years are indeed climate change, and the opportunity, the business opportunity of climate change, and also digital technologies and biotech digital technologies. But these are the great effects of a climate constrained world. Sequester carbon, can provide or make any kind of climate to reap quite large rewards. And we saw under the Paris Agreement, this idea, this terrible idea of what's called net zero, and that net zero carbon, which basically legitimated hundreds, thousands of very large corporations to make these promises that they would somehow offset all of their fossil emissions, their greenhouse gas emissions, through investing in carbon credits, in offsets, and in new technologies. And in order to realize that, we now have a scramble, which is exactly the scramble that Gates and others are involved with, to try and find places to sequester carbon. And the big place that they're interested in is agricultural soils, find technologies that could be claimed to reduce carbon, and whether they work, for example, with very major investments in synthetic engineered foods, and likewise digital technology. The idea is that companies such as Bayer, which is formerly Monsanto, and Corteva, formerly Dow DuPont, are switching over their focus to provide these digital platforms where farmers will sign up for the digital platforms. And in fact, Bayer already has something like, I forget, it's like 70 million acres or something under this. And data will be streaming off of the fields. It will be transferred it will be processed in the cloud by artificial intelligence, and then given back to the farmers as prescriptions, telling them how to farm. And of course, the prescriptions are about using the inputs for industrial agriculture, and the data is being processed by Microsoft as well as Amazon, and all of this is putting the farm increasingly under the control of the big biodigital corporations, whether that's Microsoft or Amazon on the data side, or it's companies like Bayer and Syngenta in the biological side. And when you look to the Gates Foundation's website and where they see the future for agriculture, they say they hope that their goal is within 10 years, half of all smallholder farmers will be on digital platforms. Now, this directly suits the interests of Microsoft, which is the interest of Bill Gates. He has plenty of interest there. And that alongside the investments that his various arms are putting into fake foods, into microbes in the soil. He has, I think, $70 million invested in Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which he's the chair of the board. It says, and it's something like 17, maybe more, 28 high net worth individuals, including himself, Bezos, Branson, and others. When you look at that investment firm, in fact, much of their investments are in food and agriculture. There's plenty of ways in which the policies that are being set to digitize and biodigitize agriculture, to grab land and put it within carbon markets, fits absolutely perfectly into these long investment bets that Gates himself is placing. So that's what I think is going on, and none of that works for the benefit of small farmers. It's literally taking land from small farmers, taking farmers, not just farmers off the land, but also workers off the land. We heard from Shakira earlier about how the first wave of colonialism was built on black and brown bodies, and white farmers dominated that. Increasingly, white farmers in North America are now using digital agriculture in ways that marginalize and remove workers, migrant workers. So there will increasingly there'll be either no workers on the land, or those workers that there are will be increasingly controlled by digital algorithms in the way that workers in Amazon warehouses are controlled by digital algorithms. So that's what's coming.
I'm wondering if Anne or Shakira, if you could kind of connect this to this like macro scale thing that's happening to what does this future look like for small farmers and for farming collectives in the context that you work?
Okay. Most of the younger generation in Africa, or even in Kenya, but in Africa, are not interested in agriculture. It's seen as the dirty or old people job. It's a dirty job. And how the industry is promoting agriculture is talking about agribusiness. We can do agriculture, practicing agribusiness. You don't have to do what your parents did or things like that. And that's how they are getting caught into that system. So you visit young farmers who are getting access to, for example, capital, and they're doing all this kind of digital. It's already reaching in Africa. They're doing farming with drones. They're doing farming with aeroplanes, spraying over the large plantations, for example, of corn or even wheat. And so it's slowly catching up. Unfortunately, that generation is being caught at that side. The older generation, because of technological drawbacks and those challenges, are keen on a more sustainable way. And because of the challenges, for example, that have been brought by COVID-19, the rise in non-communicable diseases like the cancers, the diabetes, the hypertension, you find the older generation trying to even go back to their local varieties of millet, sorghum, finger millet, and all those for nutrition. We work in a group in a county called Kisumu, and it's a women's group that most of them are either widowed or have people who are living with HIV/AIDS, and they have brought back a lot of these foods, mostly for nutrition, because one of the ways that they would advise those who are on ARVs, they have to take that good nutrition as they cook on this food. As they take the ARVs, they have to eat well. So the interesting bit about that is that this group has been able to bring back even vegetables that had been lost. We have supported them in building a community, we call it a community seed learning facility, because a seed bank in Kenya, a farmer is not considered a breeder. They cannot run a seed bank. It's in the law, in our seed laws, they can even get arrested. And they're even selling those seeds. Those who need the seeds are approaching them and getting to buy those vegetables, those cuttings and those things that they need to grow the local varieties for improved nutrition. And so change comes, some of the challenges that we have can bring change. With COVID-19, many people are now going back. If you have a small garden, produce your own vegetables because of that challenge with markets. When the country was in a lockdown for several months, accessing markets was hard. And so people thought, let me just produce my own vegetables. So to reiterate, that is getting slowly into Africa, especially among the younger youth who are told, practice agribusiness for the future, agribusiness is money, leave this kind of agriculture that's promoting agroecology or ways that are seen to be a bit backward, which have supported and fed generations for many years. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And I'll add a very small amount of tidbits saying that basically the Black Dirt Farm Collective operates in a way that we understand that we need a radical shift in power, which means we need to move money and resources rapidly. I think the UN gave us 20 years, or I mean, this immediate decade, the next 10 years are going to be really critical for the survival of humanity on this planet. And so we know we don't take that lightly. And so we understand that transferring power means transferring land ownership back to people of color. And so that's where we start. We start by becoming landowners, although the private ownership of land as a system is highly problematic, you know, and I'm sure many of us know why. I won't get into the details of that. But when we become owners of the land, we have more say over what happens on the land. We have greater decision-making power in how we operate as farmers on the land, instead of farmer employees of corporations who own the land. So that makes a big difference, because these paternalistic tech-driven strategies fail to interrogate who's controlling the resources and making all of the decisions in regards to the soil, the seeds, the water, and so on. And so, if we're not talking about deconsolidating not just the, you know, the inputs, talking about it in this very neoliberal sense, but, you know, our kin, these are our kin, the seeds are our kin, the trees are our kin, like we're land stewards. We're not attempting to replicate the commodification of land. And so the macro lens connects to the micro lens, and we farm in a way that reflects that all in a very synergistic way.
Thank you so much for all of these perspectives. And I think these lead really well into the next question, which is about some of these really different approaches to what the future looks like and should look like, as expressed in the United Nations Food Systems Summit. And we've heard from Matt already about some of the history of the UN Food Systems Summit and how it came about, and how it has sidelined civil society and pursued a very industrial and corporate-led agricultural model. And as someone wrote in the comments just a minute ago, we know that in some countries, some of the national preparatory meetings around the UNFSS are sponsored by AGRA and the Gates Foundation. So often these kinds of events, these high-level events, end up seeming very out there and very disconnected from ordinary people's lives and experiences, at least in terms of the kinds of policies and discussions and resolutions that come out of them. So Stephano, we wanted to ask you to comment a little bit about the significance and the stakes of UNFSS, and as activists and members of the public, is this something that we should be concerned about?
Thank you so much, Ashley. And indeed, as a civil society mechanism and civil society indigenous people mechanism to the CFS, at the very beginning, when we heard about this Food System Summit, the first reaction was to simply let it happen, right? You know, it seemed to be one of these high-level spotlights events with the usual speeches and a little more than that. And our initial reaction was to simply sort of ignore it and keep on advancing our struggles as we normally do. But then, as Matt described before, when we see that, when we've seen that the president of AGRA was actually being invited as special envoy to lead the summit preparation, something didn't quite sound right. And we started understanding how to confront and how to react to these circumstances. Indeed, the summit, I think, has been a strategy to move early from the side of the industrialists of the World Economic Forum and many other large corporations and technological platforms. Because over the past few years, there have been the emergence of this so-called food system approach. And the food system approach is really a different paradigm than the one of agricultural productivism. It recognizes the multiplicity and multidimensionality of food, and the fact the food systems are not only about supporting producing food, they support many public objectives, and therefore they are in fact a critical locus for public policies and for public investments. And the obvious corollary of this food system approach is that there is a need to reclaim them from market-based mechanism, from the completely abdication of power by governments and by the public for market-led mechanisms. And it's clear that no industrial or corporate agricultural approach would ever pass the test of a multiple assessment that integrates not only sort of food, but health, ecological, social, cultural, livelihoods, and many other dimensions. So the idea, I think, of the World Economic Forum and many of the industries that has led this process was to jump ahead of the train and try to really capture the narratives, ensure that this food system approach would actually be rewritten in terms which continues to be those of techno-solutionism and corporate-led agriculture, with this continuous mantra of the need to feed the planet, and very often with a very strong and narrow definition of science and evidence, thanks to that particular portion of formal science, which is industry friendly and supports technological solutionism in all its forms. But the most worrying aspect of this Food System Summit is maybe certainly these capture narratives is of course very dangerous, because it then would correspond to the continuous capture of normative and fiscal instruments in favor of corporate-led solutions rather than people's-led solution. But what is particularly concerning is the capture of governance. The food system has started to create a whole series of task force coalitions, action groups, national processes of all types, without anyone deciding over this. It is literally been mushrooming, some sort of a make your own pizza approach. Every organization, every foundation would come in and create its own SORA structure. So there is now an entire architecture of different meetings and different action coalitions, which is completely bypassing governmental decision-making. And don't get me wrong, it's not that governmental decision-making is a panacea. We know how much democratic deficits it carries and how complicated that is. But certainly, at least the legitimate intergovernmental spaces offer opportunities for engagement, certain levels of accountability and transparency, particularly because some of these, and particularly the Committee on World Food Security, has been built over the years as the only space in which particularly small-scale producers can participate directly into the decision-making process. It doesn't necessarily mean that it always goes as intended, but at least there are open and transparent mechanisms of governance. What the Food System Summit is trying to do is trying to lead a reform towards multi-stakeholderism, bypassing the legitimate decision-making of governments into this, bringing in corporate players and technological platform straight into the decision-making model without a decision. It's almost a reform by displacing the existing platform, the existing mechanism, with this new huge infrastructure, which nobody has decided upon and continues to be dramatically nebulous. And this is the reason why civil society and indigenous people mechanism decided to step and generate a counter mobilization and a response to all of these, for once deciding not to join the process, but actually contrast and boycott the process from outside. So I guess I'll stop here for the time being. I'm sure others will want to add their own contributions.
Jim?
Please, Jim.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a few things. I just put in the chat a link to a report that Etc. Group just released, sort of looking at the narratives of the Food System Summit and why they're problematic. And it was really interesting digging into the language and the narratives that the promoters are using, particularly agro. I think there's an interesting question to ask is why? Why does the World Economic Forum and very large agribusiness feel that they want a global food summit at this moment? Why do they want to do that and try and shift governance right now in such a blatant way? And I think part of the answer to that is about the shift that's going on in the food system. It's that we are moving, they are trying to move us to this new bio-digital food system, where they will be able to roll out large digital systems. We're seeing that right from the the consumer end, where especially through the pandemic, we've seen an acceleration of digital platforms as being the way in which people are expected to buy food, and centralizing that in the hands of digital players, right through to this sort of digital agriculture on the field, and then biodigital production of new forms of genetic engineering, gene editing, synthetic biology, and so forth. And that notion of a sort of very technocratically controlled set of value chains doesn't sit well with the way that governance was going at the Committee on World Food Security, for example, where the civil society mechanism that Stephano is speaking here for, Indigenous peoples mechanism, actually had quite a lot of say, and farmers had a lot of say, and there was a lot of talk about agroecology. It's becoming increasingly an important part of the discussion there, and that's not the way that that agribusiness wants governance to go. I think it's interesting to see how the Gates Foundation has played at the CSM. In fact, what the Gates Foundation has put on the agenda is the idea of data for decision making. They want to try and shift decision making around food such that it's determined increasingly by data, and they would like to see more and more platforms that are gathering together data from the field, data from the food system, and then there's a sort of automatic set of outcomes on how you make decisions about food systems. That's moving away from decision making by farmers or by Indigenous peoples. So, you know, as much as they want to see all smallholder farmers on the data platforms, at the same time, they want the data platforms to be what decides policy, and will take the farmers, the food movements, the Indigenous people out of decision making. And that's a very big drive that's going on. And we're seeing, for example, in the UN Food System Summit process, an attempt to create a new expert body, a scientific body, that would displace the existing expert body, the high-level panel of experts, which has a range of diversity of expertise. And they want to narrow that right down to a very technocratic, more scientific, more data-driven type of expertise.
Great. We do need to move on to the final question, but before we do that, I wanted to see if Anne or Shakira had comments on this discussion.
Thank you. I can say something small, and thank you very much, Stephano. Always invigorating to listen to you. I think this corporate capture, we see it happening not only, for example, in the US or other parts of Europe, but also in Africa. That change in terms of policy, change in terms of attitude. When you visit smallholder farmers, they're now so dependent on hybrids. When you tell them, and they start complaining that we can't replant these hybrids, the vigor, the vitality has gone down. And yet they have their local varieties, which you can improve. So that change even in attitude, people not appreciating what they have. You have investments going now into even our milling companies and from American corporations putting in money there to control corn. You see it even, for example, in the push for genetically modified foods. In Kenya now, there's the approval of BT cotton, GMO cassava. Cassava being one of the local varieties is, there are ways of controlling, for example, the cassava brown streak disease by having clean seed and not moving it from one area to another. But now we want the corporate, we have to do GMO cassava. Of course, their ultimate game plan is GMO maize. There is even investment going into the new technologies like synthetic biology, gene editing, even with no regulation in place. And the amount of money that is even being put in our research institutions by corporates and multinationals to drive research in those institutions, all with the aim of this corporate capture of the food system. Because once you control, for example, the seed, you control the food system. You can see like in the US, the GMAs, Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, the market for maize is so huge if you capture that. So that is the ultimate game plan. We saw in Nigeria recently, GMO cowpeas being, there's a push towards that. And now the new technologies, if you look at climate, you're looking at geoengineering, the good work that ETC has done to show that kind of corporate capture. And so it's very important that we look at all these issues in a holistic manner to understand the kind of dynamics. When Gates puts money in Monsanto now, Bayer, when he puts money into geoengineering, when he puts money into push for 5G, and all these, there are always implications to it. It's about the money, it's about profit for him. Thank you.
Great. So we'd like to move on now to just talking about alternatives. And I know that's a lot of our webinar audience members are already sharing a lot of these critiques and are concerned about these developments and are already supportive of the food sovereignty movement. So we have some ideas of ways for the audience members to take action and remain involved, but we would love to hear from our panelists first about some of the ways that individuals and collectives can take meaningful and powerful action. So we'd love to hear from you. And we also have a couple of questions in the chat that we'd like to raise for you after hearing your perspectives on this. And this is open to anyone to respond. Stephano?
Yeah, I'll just chip in with a small notion. Within the food justice or food sovereignty movement, there's always been some very deep disbelief in global institutions, because global institutions, no matter which ones, have all been part and parcel of the current racial and colonial pattern of globalization. You know, it doesn't matter whether you can distinguish between which ones is more culpable, but they're all part of that particular organization. Unfortunately, we can't do without. Let's say the reality is that today we are in a situation in which resistance in territories is not enough. It's a little bit like being downstream of a waterfall. The pressure and the energy of the water that comes from the global is so huge and too strong to resist exclusively locally. So we do need upstream regulation. We need to reclaim certain global institutions to rectify and redirect the current partner of hyperglobalization. I know this is a big proposition, and it's in many ways extremely difficult to really rally against. It's always easy to condemn them and agree that it's always the fault of these institutions, but we need to reclaim them. And that's the reason why the counter mobilization, the decision to stay out of the Food System Summit, is an attempt to defend and actually reclaim the UN space and contrast this extent of control by corporations, by technological platforms, and by philanthropies. So I think in our mix of actions, this idea of reclaiming global institutions, and particularly the United Nations, is essential, because without that upstream regulation, it's very difficult to purely resist within local territories. That's my little contribution. Thanks.
Jim, you had, yeah.
I would and I just add something to that, which is, one of the things that looking at the UN Food Systems Summit and how it's problematic on so many levels raises the question of what is the summit we do want? What is the convergence and coming together and working together that we do want? And part of the reason that our opponents, if you like, felt that had to happen was because of the success of the food sovereignty movement, the global food sovereignty movement, and of the success of agroecology. Food sovereignty came out of Nyalini. It came from African movements, not just Africans, but others coming together with African food movements. And there really are discussions underway within food movements to have a next Nyalini, Nyalini 3. And I think this is a great moment for movements to be talking about how they can come together, food movements, and really properly define food sovereignty in the face of digitalization in the face of these attempts to change the food system, and learning from everything that we have learned in the last 25 years of food sovereignty. So I think these attempts to have movement-led spaces to reclaim governance over the global food system and local food system, that's where we have to put our energy.
Shakira or Anne, do you want to add anything to this about resistance and alternatives?
Yeah, I'm struggling on where to begin. It's there's so much to do. There's so much to say. Yeah, I'll go back to, so I really love your emphasis on movements, Jim, and I'll add that our movements are in desperate need of resources, not just financial capital, but infrastructure, because we're alchemists. We pride ourselves on being alchemists, and we make mountains out of many hills, right? And that's our job as movements, as movement builders. And still, it would be nice to not have to always struggle to do what we know what needs to be done. Meanwhile, the ultra rich are basking in billions and billions of dollars and other resources that should rightfully be ours, because we have the solutions in our hands. We just need the resources to push them forward. And so, yeah, moving money and moving people to the right places is really essential. And ultimately, it's about the rematriation of land. So we can talk about reformist approaches, but we know that reforming is not going to produce the ultimate reality that we need. Because as Audre Lorde, Black queer feminist, says, you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. So we have to completely dismantle the system in place and start from scratch. And that happens first and foremost with rematriating land back to Indigenous peoples, paying Black people reparations, and so on and so on. Like, that's how we get to the root of it all. That's how we address the agenda that the UN Food System Summit should be pursuing around debt extraction, colonialism, war, and so on, and how these all of these things intersect with food systems.
Thank you very much, Shakira. And for me, is to reiterate the need for change, starting from the different generations. We working in the global south, several small things that we are doing, they need to be anchored and multiplied and shown out there. And it's very important, like reaching out to the younger generation, the youth, and learning how we produce in a sustainable way, teaching them about these challenges. This is a conversation happening in the US. Be happy to do more conversations in Africa with the younger generation to understand these dynamics, the need for that system change. But also the networks that we are working in. We belong to the Alliance of Food Sovereignty in Africa, which is a network of networks in Africa. The likes of La Via Campesina, the Pelham Association, Copagen, ROPA, and all those are there. Voice also, the voice is very important to be heard in such spaces. And we're very happy that even as AFSA, we took a lead and withdrew from this UNFSS Food System Conference and raised our concerns. And that's very important that our voices keep on being heard. Sitting at the back and just speaking and saying, oh, it's really bad, doesn't really add value. But the voices being heard from the global south, the global north, that concerted effort will ensure that change will happen. It may take years, but just like a revolution, it does not happen immediately. Thank you very much.
Great. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists for a really engaging and wonderful discussion. And just to wrap up, we'd like to plug a couple of upcoming events and ways to take action, some of which the panelists already mentioned. So the first thing that's upcoming, a way for people to take action, is that, as was mentioned in the chat, the annual Agri conference will be held from September 6th to 10th this year, and it's branding itself as a summit, kind of echoing the UN Food Systems Summit. And if you're a member of an organization, we encourage you to support this movement to defund AGRA. That's led by a consortium of organizations and championed by the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. So we're in the process of preparing a sign-on letter that representatives of organizations can sign, encouraging donor governments and independent donors to not refund AGRA in its new cycle. And we'll follow up after this webinar with details on how to do that. And we are also participating in a decentralized call to action in mid to late September to oppose the UNFSS. So someone in the chat raised the question of how to make voices heard if we're boycotting the UNFSS, and the way that that strategy is emerging is around kind of building and advancing the kind of summit that we want, that supports community-led and agro-ecological agricultural practices. So please stay tuned also for updates about how to participate in that. And we also encourage everyone to get involved with CAGJ, or if you're already involved, to stay involved with our work. One way to do that is to share the recording of this webinar widely. As I mentioned in the start, we will be communicating this by email after the event. We encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media, become a CAGJ member if you're not one already, and subscribe to our monthly newsletter for updates and event announcements. We also have 2 upcoming very exciting events for people to plug into. The first one is on September 29th. We will be hosting a free virtual screening of Raj Patel's new documentary, The Ants and the Grasshopper, which looks to be a fantastic, wonderful film. We encourage you to join us for that. And on October 9th, we will be having our Strengthening Local Economies Everywhere annual gala. It will be virtual this year, unfortunately, due to COVID-19. And the keynote speaker is Raj Patel. So this is going to be a really fantastic event, and tickets are on a sliding scale. We encourage you to register for that event and join us there if you haven't already. And with that, I would like to once again thank our fantastic panelists for joining us today and sharing their perspectives and experiences. And thank you to our audience members for joining us from wherever you are. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.